I mean, a lot of people, and this happens in the monogamy world too. You have a crush on somebody, or you're interested in somebody, and then you start seeing them, or sleeping with them, or you fall in love, and then people just lose their shit. And there's been some really interesting brain research in the last several years now that with functional MRI machines, and there's some great TED talks on this as well. That basically, um, when you fall in love, the centers of the brain that are active are the exact same centers of the brain that are active when you're addicted to cocaine. So when people fall in love, they basically become crack addicts, and your dealer, your dopamine dealer, is the person you're in love with. And so this explains why a lot of people, when they fall in love, they rent the U-Haul the next weekend, and then they move in together without having any idea if you guys are actually compatible for having a relationship. And everything feels great while you're in love, but then eventually you start to realize that, like, what the hell all the things that are wrong with the relationship. So the dating your species approach is really, before you fall in love with people, how do you vet them for that, if they're a good fit for the ways that you do polyamory in this case, or the ways that you swing, right? Because we know in the lifestyle community, there's people that really love doing full swap or soft swap, or swingers who only swing when they're together in the same room versus ones who like to take it into separate rooms. Hopefully you're in a relationship with somebody who's a good fit for you and how you want to be non-monogamous, but also, are you picking people to bring into your family constellation, or however you do your non-monogamy? Are you picking people who are a good fit for how you do non-monogamy? And when you don't pick people that are a good fit, and you both fall in love, it wreaks a lot of havoc in your little ecosystem of non-monogamy, and that becomes really problematic. And so this is kind of how I look at when I talk about dating your species, and this approach also works in monogamy as well. But then inside of non-monogamy, what kind of what's your polyamory style, if we're talking about polyamory. And some of the things that I've noticed, and this is something that people can get on my website if they go to the store. There's a whole e-course on this, but do you know what a good fit for you is polyamory wise? What's your poly match? And that there's four basic categories that I talk about in that course, and it's the idea that people are kind of primary wired in poly, in that their non-monogamy works best or better when they have a Batman to their Robin. They have their primary partner. Then their non-monogamy just works better for them. Then there are people that are what I would call fixed pairs, where it's that person who feels best when they have their two or three primary or secondary relationships. It's that poly person who's happiest when they have the triad or the quad. And that for them, until they have that unit, it doesn't feel locked in or grounded. And this can be very much like when you look at parenting again. There are some parents who just don't feel like it's the family unit's there until they had that third kid or the second kid. Whereas somebody, is like, I only want one kid. Like, give me three and I'll cut my throat. Like, no. So you could look at parenting is really the best cultural analogy to use that doesn't have a lot of stigma to it, where people realize, oh, there's more love and there's a sweet spot. We don't usually shame parents for having two or three kids. It's like, what? One wasn't enough? You can't just love one? But when we start talking about relationships and sexual relationships, it gets all weird. The third category for poly styles is what I would call dolphin pod tribal type poly folks who they just feel really good when they've got their their little posse of people, and it's not really, maybe there's people come and go, but they're more tribal in how non-monogamy works for them. And then the fourth basic category, and we could create other categories, but if we just keep it simple, then there are people that I would call lone wolves. People who love their autonomy, and when they're with you, they're with you, and when they're not with you, they're not really thinking about you too much. But they're non-monogamous. And in the monogamy world, there are those people too. Like when I'm with you, we're great, but when I'm doing my thing, I'm doing my thing. And so when you start looking at how, what styles work best for you, are you dating people who are also complementary styles, or whose styles are a perfect match for you? That can help lessen a lot of the friction and the extra effort that doesn't have to be there in a relationship. Like, and again, like, it's if you change out your metrics for success, if it's not duration but depth and transparency, then when things shift, which they do, you get to have a real conversation about, well, what do we need to make this work, and do we want to continue making it work? Rather than, my mom and dad stayed together till the bitter end because they wouldn't have the conversation about whether they were actually happy. And so, as things shift, especially, well, this is a whole other thing that's useful for just relationships in general. Most people never ask themselves why they're in a relationship to begin with. Like, what's your intention, or what's your reason for even being in a relationship? Most people just start dating and get into a relationship because that's what they think they're supposed to have or do. In the same way, like 2 generations ago, everybody thought they were supposed to get married and have kids. Like, that was the standard narrative. So, why do you want to have kids? Like, what's the actual reason? Why do you want to get married? Like, what's the intention there? So if you're, looking at relationships and trying to match intentions, then, if your reason for being in a relationship is a good fit and similar or compatible to my reason, then you and I having a relationship together, a lot can change and shift, but our reasons for being in a relationship are still a good fit. And so there's a lot more leeway for us to figure out how to make it work. What ends up happening is a lot of people get into a relationship, they have different reasons for being in a relationship, and then they have to work really hard to keep it together as things shift, and maybe they grow in different directions. So when you know what your own reason for being in a relationship is, and the other person's reasons for being in a relationship make sense, and you guys are compatible, then what's left is you create a shared intention for why you're in a relationship with each other. And then as all kinds of stuff can move and change, and if you can change the shared intention, but if all you have is a shared intention and 2 completely incompatible reasons for being in relationships at all, it's really hard to hold things together. And so people work super hard. Like basically, if you have a 69 Shelby Fastback Mustang and Ford Mustang, but you have a Plymouth engine, you could work really hard and get the wrong kind of engine to work in a different car, or go get a Mustang engine. It'll fit great. And so a lot of people are trying so hard to make something work. It's perfectly good engine, perfectly good car, but they have to work super hard just to get it to all work together. And then over time they get resentful because they're squandering their own self-expression to make the relationship last longer. And then that resentment builds up until there's a big enough train wreck that they can both leave the relationship and save face. And again, like if for the people who are listening who are already in a relationship, there's a lot you can do to make that Plymouth engine work in the Ford Mustang. But especially if you're in non-monogamous relationships, the other people that you pick and bring them into your relationship, doing the due diligence to make sure they're a good fit really helps the ecosystem. And then people have more energy to show up and really show up and work on the relationship when it's a tough time versus, trying to fit 7 different engines into one car, which is never going to happen the right way. That wasn't a good analogy, but you get what I mean. So being more mindful in relationships, period, I think is more useful than falling in love. When you really look at the brain chemistry of love, love is a horrible reason to start a relationship. So people can go to readaboutsex.com, REID, aboutsex.com. That's my main website. If you're curious, there's a bunch of buttons on the site. You can check out my latest projects. If you're interested in buying a Sex Geek shirt, you can get them on my store. That's the main place to go. If you want to follow me on Twitter, it's Reid About Sex, REID About Sex on Twitter. It's Reid About Sex on Facebook. Like basically, I'm a social media whore. You can find me anywhere. Just Google Reid About Sex. And I just want to say thank you for having this conversation, and for creating the creative projects that you're midwifing and Sherpaing, so that people can have more conversation about what the choices are out there for them in their lives, so that hopefully they don't spend 20 years, in a relationship that isn't what makes them happiest. So thank you again for doing what you do.